Good evening, friends, and welcome back to another peaceful journey through the gentle corridors of history. Tonight, we'll drift into the ancient world, where stone whispers secrets and time moves like honey in moonlight. I'm here to guide you through stories that unfold slowly, like pages turning in an old book by candlelight. Go ahead and dim your lights now. Let that soft glow settle around you like an old friend's embrace. Pull your blanket a little closer. Feel the weight of it against your shoulders. Take a breath and let it out slowly. Tonight, we're traveling to Rome, to Saxon halls, two places where history sleeps in shadows and dreams. If this calm journey helps you unwind, if these whispered tales bring you peace, feel free to tap like and subscribe. Lie if it feels right, only if it brings you comfort. No pressure, just gratitude for sharing this quiet space with me. Now, close your eyes and let me tell you about ruins and recipes, about missing stones and ancient meals, about the way history tastes when it's seasoned with time itself. Let me tell you a story about the most famous ruin in the world, a place where echoes still bounce off broken walls and the ghosts of gladiators might just nod hello if you listen closely enough. The Colosseum in Rome, that magnificent oval giant, sits there today like a beautiful smile missing half its teeth. But why? You might wonder as you settle deeper into your pillow. Why does only half of this ancient wonder still stand? Picture yourself walking through the streets of Rome on a cool evening, the kind where the air carries just a whisper of ancient dust and modern pizza. The Colosseum looms before you, its weathered travertine glowing honey gold in the setting sun. From one angle, it looks nearly complete, a testament to Roman engineering that could make a modern architect weep with envy. But walk around to the other side, and suddenly you're staring at what looks like the world's most expensive construction site, abandoned. Mead Project. The missing southern wall, my sleepy friends, tells a story more dramatic than any gladiatorial battle that ever took place within those walls. Imagine, if you will, the year 847 AD. Rome isn't the mighty capital it once was. The emperors are long gone, the legions scattered to the winds, and the great arena that once hosted 50,000 screaming spectators now stands mostly empty, hosting mainly pigeons and the occasional bewildered tourist who got very, very lost in time. On a summer morning that year, the earth beneath Rome began to tremble. Not the gentle trembling of a cat purring on your chest, but the angry, violent shaking of tectonic plates having a serious disagreement about property lines. The earthquake of 847 struck with the force of nature's own wrecking ball, and the Colosseum, already weakened by centuries of neglect, felt every violent shake in its ancient bones. Now, you might think that earthquakes are like those action movies, where everything explodes at once in a spectacular display of destruction. But the truth is far more subtle, more like the way old relationships end not with a bang, but with a slow, inexorable crumbling. The 847 earthquake damaged the Colosseum, yes, but it didn't immediately topple the southern wall. That would take time, neglect, and a series of smaller earthquakes, working together like a team of very patient demolition experts. Close your eyes and imagine the sound of settling stones in the centuries that followed. Each minor tremor, each shift in the foundation, Each winter frost, expanding in tiny cracks, created a symphony of destruction so slow you could barely hear it happening. The Romans had built their arena to last millennia, using techniques that modern engineers still study with the kind of reverence usually reserved for religious texts. But even Roman concrete, that miraculous mixture of volcanic ash and lime that still puzzles scientists today, couldn't withstand the patient persistence of geological forces by the time the second major earthquake struck in 1349. The Colosseum had become Rome's most expensive dominoes set. The quake triggered what engineers today call progressive collapse. Imagine a row of books on a shelf, where pushing one causes the next to fall, and the next, and the next, until half your library is scattered across the floor. Except these books were massive travertine blocks, each weighing as much as a small car, and when they fell with the finality of history itself. But here's where the story becomes as fascinating as it is sleepy time soothing. The collapsed stones didn't just disappear into some historical black hole. Oh no, they became the building blocks of a new Rome, scattered like seeds throughout the city. If you walk through Rome today, you're literally surrounded by pieces of the Colosseum, those magnificent palaces lining the Tiber. Many were built with Colosseum stone. The steps of St. Peter's Basilica, some of those very stones once echoed with the roar of crowds cheering for gladiators. Picture the medieval Romans, practical as their ancestors, looking at this enormous pile of pre-cut building materials and thinking what any sensible person would think. Well, this is convenient. They didn't see ruins. They saw a quarry, a very expensive, conveniently located quarry that some long-dead emperor had thoughtfully provided for their construction needs. Wealthy Renaissance nobles with more ambition than sentiment were particularly enthusiastic about this historical recycling program. They built their palace using so much Colosseum stone that Romans coined a phrase that still echoes through time. What the barbarians didn't destroy, the Barberini did. It's the kind of historical burn that would make a Twitter flame war look gentle. Imagine the conversations at those Renaissance dinner parties. Magnificent staircase, Maffio. Where did you source the travertine? Oh, I picked it up at the old gladiator arena. Bit of a fixer-upper, that place. We're really doing the neighborhood a favor by cleaning it up. The irony is as thick as Roman concrete. The very stones that once witnessed the most spectacular entertainment in human history, gladiator battles that drew crowds from across the empire, naval battles staged in a flooded arena, wild animal hunts that would make modern zoos nervous, these same stones were quietly repurposed into kitchen counters and garden walls. But let's drift back to that missing wall, that absent smile in Rome's most famous face. Stand there today in the cool evening air, feeling the weight of centuries settling around you like a comfortable blanket. The missing section tells us something profound about the nature of permanence. The Romans built for eternity, but eternity, it turns out, has its own ideas about urban planning. The surviving portion of the Colosseum stands today partly because of geography and partly because of luck. The northern section was built on more stable ground. Its foundations sunk deeper into bedrock that could weather earthquakes like a stone ship riding out geological storms. The southern section, built on softer alluvial soil, was like a house built on sand, magnificent when everything was calm, vulnerable when the earth decided to dance. There's something oddly comforting about this impermanence, isn't there? As you lie there in your bed, safe and warm, consider that even the mightiest structures humans have ever built eventually become part of something else. The Colosseum didn't die. It transformed. It became palaces and churches, steps and walls, scattered throughout the eternal city like the pieces of an enormous jigsaw puzzle reassembled into 1,000 different pictures. Modern preservation efforts now protect what remains. But they came almost too late. By the 18th century, the Colosseum was so thoroughly plundered that it looked more like an ancient skeleton than a building. Tourists would visit and sketch what looked like the ribcage of some enormous, mythical beast, which, in a way, it was the bones of the empire, bleached white by centuries of sun and rain. Today, engineers use techniques that would amaze the original Roman builders. Ground-penetrating radar maps the underground structure. Computer models predict stress patterns, and seismic isolation systems protect against future earthquakes. We're trying to preserve in the 21st century what nature and necessity scattered across medieval Rome. But perhaps the most beautiful truth about the missing half is this: it's not really missing at all. It's hiding in plain sight throughout Rome, supporting new dreams, sheltering new stories. Every time you touch a Roman wall built after 1349, you might be touching a piece of the Colosseum. The arena lives on, not as a complete monument to imperial power, but as scattered fragments of utility and beauty, integrated into the living city like memories woven into daily life. And now, as we prepare to leave the broken majesty of the Colosseum, let that image settle in your mind like dust on ancient stones, half present, half absent, entirely magnificent in its imperfection. The missing wall teaches us that sometimes the most beautiful stories are the ones about what we've lost, what we've found, and what we've chosen to keep. Now, let your mind wander from those broken stones to something far more intimate, far more human. Let me tell you about what those Roman soldiers ate, the ones who built the empire that gave us the Colosseum in the first place. Close your eyes and imagine the smell of wood smoke drifting across a military camp, the sound of iron pots bubbling over carefully tended fires, and the quiet conversation of men who were thousands of miles from home, sharing a meal under foreign stars. The Roman legionaries' diet was as carefully engineered as their roads, as systematic as their conquests, and considerably more practical than their togas. These weren't men dining on peacock tongues and dormice stuffed with honey. That was the aristocratic fantasy happening back in Rome, while real Romans were out, building an empire, one carefully planned meal at a time. Picture, if you will, a Roman soldier waking up in a leather tent somewhere along Hadrian's Wall, frost covering the ground outside, his breath visible in the cold British air. The first thing he reaches for isn't his sword or his shield, it's his portion of hardtack, a biscuit so dense and durable it could probably stop an arrow if properly positioned. Roman military hardtack, called bucellatum, was the ancient world's closest thing to astronaut food, designed not for pleasure, but for survival. These biscuits were baked until they were hard enough to break teeth, then stored in leather bags where they would remain edible for months, possibly years. Imagine biting into something with the texture of a roof tile and the flavor of concentrated grain. The soldiers would soften them in whatever liquid was available: water, if they were lucky; wine, if they were luckier; or their own saliva, if they were having one of those days when the empire felt particularly demanding. But hardtack was just the foundation of the Roman military diet. The way a drumbeat is the foundation of a song. The real star of the legionary mess hall was something called posca, a drink that sounds sophisticated until you realize it was essentially wine that had gone bad, mixed with water and sometimes honey. Think of it as the ancient world's sports drink. If sports drinks were made from wine to sour to serve at dinner parties, posca was served in pottery, cups that each soldier carried in his pack, cups worn smooth by thousands of hands and stained by thousands of meals. The drink itself was refreshing in its own austere way, with just enough alcohol to kill whatever microscopic invaders might be lurking in questionable water sources, and just enough acidity to wake up taste buds that had grown accustomed to military rations. Now, let me tell you about pulmentum, the Roman military's answer to comfort food. This was a porridge made from whatever grains were available: wheat when the supply lines were functioning smoothly, barley when they weren't, and occasionally millet when things got truly desperate. But calling it porridge doesn't do justice to the care and creativity that went into this humble dish. Picture a Roman cook, a legionary hood-drawn kitchen duty for the week, stirring a massive iron cauldron over a fire that needed constant attention. He'd toast the grains first, bringing out their nutty flavor, then slowly add water or diluted wine, stirring constantly to prevent the kind of lumps that could start riots among hungry soldiers. Into this base, he'd fold whatever was available: dried peas that had been soaking since morning, strips of salt pork that had traveled from Gaul, wild greens foraged from the countryside by soldiers who'd learned to identify edible plants the way modern soldiers learned to identify friend from foe. The result was something that would be recognizable to anyone who's ever made risotto: creamy, satisfying, warming from the inside out. But pulmentum had advantages that risotto lacked. It was cheap, it was filling, it traveled well, and it could be made in quantities large enough to feed a century of soldiers. Roughly 80 men who'd worked up impressive appetites, building roads and conquering territories. But perhaps the most ingenious aspect of Roman military cuisine was their approach to protein. These weren't men who could rely on fresh meat very often, not when they were constantly on the move. Not when fresh meat spoiled faster than wine in the Mediterranean sun. Instead, they developed preservation techniques that would make a modern food scientist nod with respect. Garum, the Roman fish sauce, was their secret weapon against bland food and dietary deficiency. Made from fish entrails fermented in salt for several months. It sounds absolutely revolting until you taste it and realize it's basically the ancient equivalent of Worcestershire sauce. A few drops of garum could transform the most mundane bowl of pulmentum into something approaching flavorful, and it provided essential nutrients that kept the legions healthy on long campaigns. The soldiers would carry small amphora of garum in their packs, carefully wrapped and precious as gold. Picture a grizzled centurion, scarred from battles in Germania, carefully doling out drops of fish sauce into his evening porridge with the concentration of a master chef plating a final course. This wasn't fine dining, but it was fine living, the art of making the best of whatever the empire provided. Cheese was another cornerstone of the military diet, specifically a hard cheese called Caseus lunensis that could survive the rigors of campaign life. Aged in caves until it was hard enough to use as a weapon. This cheese would be shaved into thin strips and added to everything from porridge to hardtack to whatever vegetables the soldiers could forage or purchase from local farmers. Imagine the taste: sharp, salty, with the complex flavors that come from proper aging. Picture a Roman soldier sitting around a campfire, using his pugio, the short dagger every legionary carried, to scrape thin curls of cheese into his wooden bowl. The firelight dancing across weathered hands that were equally skilled at wielding a gladius and preparing a meal. Vegetables in the Roman military diet were both luxury and necessity, depending on the season and the location. In summer camps, soldiers would plant gardens if they were staying long enough for crops to mature. They grew leeks, onions, cabbage, and turnips, vegetables chosen not for their gourmet appeal but for their ability to grow quickly and store well. The sight of Roman legionaries tending garden plots between military exercises might seem incongruous, but it speaks to the practical genius of the Roman system. These were citizen soldiers who understood that victory depended as much on nutrition as on tactics. A well-fed army could march further, fight harder, and think more clearly than one surviving on whatever they could pillage. Wild foods supplemented these cultivated vegetables. Roman soldiers became expert foragers, learning to identify edible plants in the territories they conquered. Dandelion greens in Gaul, wild fennel in Spain, nettle in Britain. Each region offered its own botanical buffet to soldiers willing to learn from local knowledge. But let me tell you about the most ingenious Roman military food innovation. Libum, a kind of honey cake that was part dessert, part energy bar, part offering to the gods, made with cheese, eggs, flour, and honey, then wrapped in bay leaves and baked in the embers of the campfire. Libum provided concentrated calories and enough sweetness to remind homesick soldiers that life contained pleasures worth fighting for. Picture the process: soldiers gathering bay leaves at dusk, the sweet smoke rising from carefully banked fires, the anticipation as the small cakes baked through the night. By morning, they'd have something that was part breakfast, part dessert, and entirely comforting. The bay leaves weren't just wrapping, they infused the cakes with a subtle herbal flavor that elevated humble ingredients into something approaching luxury. The communal aspect of Roman military dining was as important as the food itself. Soldiers were organized into contubernia, groups of 8 men who shared a tent and ate together. They pooled their rations, took turns cooking, and shared whatever extras they could acquire through trade, foraging, or the occasional windfall of a successful battle. Imagine the conversations around those campfires, the stories shared over bowls of pulmon, the jokes told while waiting for libum to bake. These men were building relationships that would hold the line in battle, and food was the medium through which those bonds were forged. A shared meal under the stars, seasoned with garum and sweetened with honey, was as much a part of Roman military strategy as the testudo formation or the gladius. Wine, when it was available, turned these simple meals into something approaching festive. Roman soldiers received a wine ration, that was considered essential for morale and health. But this wasn't the fine vintages that graced senatorial tables. Strong wine that was often diluted with water to make it last longer and to keep the soldiers functional. Picture the ritual of the evening wine distribution. The centurion measuring out portions with the care of a pharmacist. Soldiers holding out their cups in a ceremony as old as the legions themselves. The wine was warm, rough on the throat, but it carried with it the taste of home, the comfort of civilization, the promise that they were citizens of something greater than themselves. And now, as the campfire burns low and the last of the wine is shared among brothers in arms, let your mind drift toward other hearths, other meals, other stories waiting to be told. The Roman legions may have marched on their stomachs, but they dreamed on their memories of home, and they built an empire, one shared meal at a time. Follow me now from those Roman campfires to a different kind of gathering place, where the firelight dances higher and the stories grow longer with each passing cup. Let your mind drift north and forward in time to the misty islands where Saxon warriors gathered in halls that smelled of wood smoke, roasted meat, and the golden sweetness of fermented honey. Close your eyes and imagine walking through a heavy wooden door, thick enough to stop a bat, into a world where hospitality was sacred and the mead flowed like liquid amber. The Saxon Mead Hall wasn't just a building, it was the beating heart of early medieval community life. A place where warriors became brothers, where stories became legends, and where honey became something approaching divine intervention. Picture the great hall at Evering in Northumbria, its massive timber frame rising from the earth like the skeleton of some enormous beast, thatched roof thick enough to muffle the sound of northern storms. Step inside, and your eyes would need a moment to adjust to the warm, golden light. The central hearth dominated the space, a stone-lined pit where fires burned continuously from autumn to spring, sending smoke curling up toward the rafters like incense in a vast wooden cathedral. Along the walls, benches stretched in parallel lines, enough seating for 100 warriors, each with his own place, his own cup, his own stories to tell. But let me tell you about the centerpiece of every Saxon feast, the drink that transformed ordinary honey into liquid poetry. Mead, the oldest alcoholic beverage known to humanity, reached its artistic peak in these northern halls. The Saxon mead makers were alchemists working with just 3 ingredients: honey, water, and time. Yet, from this simple foundation, they created drinks that could make poets of warriors and diplomats of enemies. Picture the mead-making process. Beginning in late summer, when the beehives were heaviest with honey, the honey harvest was a sacred time when entire communities would gather to extract the golden treasure that would sustain them through the dark months ahead. Saxon beekeepers understood their hives with the intimacy of shepherds knowing their flocks, recognizing the subtle differences between honey made from heather flowers and honey made from apple blossoms. The finest mead began with heather honey, dark and complex, with a flavor that spoke of windswept moors and ancient stone circles. This honey was heated gently with spring water in massive bronze cauldrons. The mixture stirred with wooden paddles worn smooth by generations of mead makers. The heating had to be perfect to cool, and the honey wouldn't dissolve properly. Too hot, and the delicate flavors would be lost forever. Imagine the scent rising from those cauldrons, sweet and floral, with hints of the wild herbs the bees had visited on their daily journeys. The mead maker would taste constantly, adjusting the honey-to-water ratio with the precision of a master musician tuning an instrument. This wasn't cooking. This was craft elevated to art, with each batch bearing the signature of its maker as distinctly as a warrior bore the pattern of his sword hilt, once cooled to blood temperature. The honey water was transferred to oak barrels that had been seasoned for years, their wood impregnated with the memory of previous batches. Wild yeast, floating invisible in the air of the mead hall, would find this sweet mixture and begin the slow transformation that would turn simple honey water into the drink of heroes. The fermentation took months, sometimes years, for the finest meads. During this time, the barrels rested in the cool shadows beneath the hall, tended by the mead master with the devotion of a priest caring for sacred relics. Each barrel was checked regularly, the mead master listening to the gentle bubbling that indicated healthy fermentation, adjusting the environment to encourage the perfect balance of alcohol and flavor. But Saxon mead making was more than just fermentation, it was flavoring, and here the true artistry began. Metheglin, mead flavored with herbs and spices, was the preferred drink of nobles and kings. Picture the mead master's collection of ingredients: juniper berries that grew wild on the northern hills, adding a gin-like complexity; bog myrtle, harvested from marshlands and prized for its bitter, resinous notes; meadowsweet, whose flowers provided a flavor like vanilla and almonds combined. Each mead master guarded his recipes like military secrets. Some added rosemary for memory, believing it would help warriors remember their courage in battle. Others favored mint for its cooling properties, perfect for the heated discussions that often arose around the mead bench. The most exotic recipes included cinnamon and ginger, spices that arrived via trade routes stretching from the Saxon kingdoms to Constantinople, each pinch worth its weight in silver. The aging process was where good mead became legendary mead. The finest batches were stored in the coolest corners of the hall's underground chambers, where temperature remained constant year-round. Some Saxon nobles maintained meads that were decades old, drinks that had been begun by their fathers or grandfathers, passed down like heirlooms through generations. Picture a Saxon lord offering his most honored guest a cup of mead that had been aging since before the guest was born, the liquid glowing like captured sunlight in the horn cup, its flavor complex beyond description. This wasn't just hospitality, it was history served in liquid form, each sip connecting the drinker to the unbroken chain of tradition that held Saxon society together. The mead cups themselves were works of art. The finest were made from aurochs horns, the massive wild cattle that still roamed the northern forests. These horns were carefully cleaned, polished, and often decorated with intricate metalwork around the rim. The wealthy might own cups made from imported glass or precious metals, but the horn cup remained the traditional choice. Its curved shape perfect for holding mead and impossible to set down until empty to feature that encouraged the kind of communal drinking that built bonds between warriors. But let me tell you about the social rituals surrounding mead consumption, because these were as important as the drink itself. The mead passing ceremony was the heart of Saxon diplomatic and social life. When a lord wished to honor a guest, he would personally fill the guest's cup from his own pitcher, a gesture that signified trust, respect, and the promise of protection under his roof. The order of mead service followed strict protocol. The Lord drank first, not from ceremony, but from practicality. This proved the mead wasn't poisoned, a concern that wasn't merely paranoid in an age of frequent feuds and uncertain alliances. Then the cup would pass to the most honored guest, then to the next in rank, and so on down the benches until even the youngest warrior had received his portion. Imagine the quiet dignity of this ceremony, the weight of tradition in each gesture. The hall would fall silent as the mead was poured. The only sounds, the crackling of the fire and the soft splash of liquid gold-filling horn cups. This wasn't drinking for the sake of intoxication, though, that sometimes happened. Drinking as a sacred act that bound the community together in shared trust. The stories told over mead were as important as the drink itself. Saxon culture was largely oral, with history, law, and entertainment passed down through spoken word rather than written text. The mead hall was where young warriors learned the deeds of their ancestors, where laws were recited and remembered, where the great epic poems like Beowulf were first spoken to audiences made receptive by the golden warmth of fermented honey. Picture the scene: a skilled scop, the Saxon equivalent of a bard, standing in the firelight with his harp, weaving tales of heroes and monsters while his audience sipped mead and let their imaginations carry them to distant lands and ancient times. The mead didn't just lubricate conversation, it enhanced storytelling, making listeners more receptive to the magic of well-chosen words and stirring deeds. Seasonal variations in mead reflected the agricultural cycle that governed Saxon life. Spring mead, made with the first honey of the year, was light and delicate, flavored with early flowers and herbs. Summer mead incorporated the abundance of the growing season: strawberries, elderflowers, rose petals gathered at dawn when their fragrance was strongest. Autumn mead was rich and complex, made with the final honey harvest and flavored with the herbs and fruits of the harvest season. Winter mead was the strongest and most warming, often spiced with imported cinnamon and ginger, designed to keep spirits high during the long, dark months when the hall became the entire world for its inhabitants. The brewing of funeral mead was, perhaps, the most solemn of Saxon traditions. When a warrior died, a special batch would be prepared in his honor, flavored with his favorite herbs and aged until his funeral feast. This mead would be shared among his brothers-in-arms as they told stories of his deeds, each cup a toast to his memory, each sip a promise that his courage would live on in their hearts. As winter deepened and the mead barrels aged in their cool chambers, the hall became a refuge from the harsh world outside. Warriors who spent their summers raiding and their autumns harvesting would gather around the fire, their conflicts temporarily set aside in the sacred space of the mead hall. Here, enemies could become allies over shared cups, and young men could learn wisdom from their elders. While the wind howled outside and the fire painted dancing shadows on the wooden walls. And now, as the last stories fade into comfortable silence and the mead cups sit empty on the wooden tables, let your mind wander toward the feasts that filled these halls, the foods that accompanied the golden drink, and the festivals that marked the turning of the seasons in this world. where hospitality was sacred and every meal was a celebration of survival. Now, let your mind drift deeper into the rhythm of Saxon life, where every season brought its own celebration, and every celebration brought its own flavors. Picture yourself awakening in a Saxon village, just as the first frost begins to silver the meadows, when the air carries the scent of wood smoke and roasting meat, and the whole community stirs with the excitement of preparation for a feast that will last for days. The Saxon calendar was marked not by saints' days or Roman months, but by the agricultural cycle that governed every aspect of life. Each season's turning brought festivals that were part religious ceremony, part harvest celebration, and entirely devoted to the kind of communal feasting that transformed neighbors into family and strangers into friends. These weren't merely meals, they were rituals of survival, gratitude, and community that sustained Saxon culture through centuries of uncertainty. Let me tell you about Samhain, the festival that marked the end of harvest and the beginning of winter's dominion. As October faded into November, Saxon communities would gather their final harvests and prepare for a celebration that would carry them through the darkest months of the year. Picture the great feast tables groaning under the weight of foods that represented the bounty of the earth and the skill of human hands working in harmony with natural rhythms. The centerpiece of any Saxon feast was the roasted meat, and at Samhain, this meant entire animals slowly cooked over fires that had been burning for days. Imagine a massive boar, its skin crackling and golden, turned slowly on a spit by young men who took pride in maintaining the perfect balance between flame and meat. The fat would drip into the fire with a hiss and sizzle that provided a constant soundtrack to the preparation, while the smoke carried the scent of roasting pork across the entire village. But the boar was just the beginning. Saxon feasts embraced the principle of abundance with the enthusiasm of people who understood scarcity intimately. Alongside the boar, you might find whole sheep, their meat tender and sweet from a summer spent grazing on hill pastures dotted with wild herbs. Geese, their skin rendered crispy and their meat rich with fat, were prized both for their flavor and for the way their fat could be saved to enrich other dishes throughout the winter months. The art of Saxon seasoning was subtle but sophisticated, built around herbs that grew wild in the British countryside. Wild garlic, gathered from woodland floors in early spring and dried for use throughout the year, provided a pungent base for meat seasonings. Juniper berries, crushed and rubbed into lamb before roasting, gave the meat a flavor that was simultaneously piney and peppery. Like the northern forests themselves, picture the feast preparation beginning days before the actual celebration, with entire families working together to create dishes that would feed not just their own kin, but anyone who might arrive hungry at their door. Saxon hospitality was legendary, built on the understanding that survival depended on community, and community was strengthened by the shared breaking of bread, or, in this case, the shared tearing of roasted meat from the bone. The bread itself was a marvel of Saxon ingenuity. While the Romans had perfected white bread made from carefully sifted wheat flour, the Saxons created hearty loaves that spoke of the northern soil and climate. Their bread was made from whatever grains grew well in their particular region: barley in the cooler highlands, wheat in the more fertile valleys. Sometimes mixed grains that created complex flavors and textures that varied from village to village. But the most distinctly Saxon bread was made with honey. Picture loaves, golden brown from the honey mixed into the dough, slightly sweet and with a texture that stayed moist far longer than ordinary bread. This honey bread was often shaped into braids or wheels, patterns that held significance in Saxon religious practice and made the bread itself a kind of edible art. Let me tell you about the vegetables that graced Saxon feast tables, because these reveal a sophisticated understanding of nutrition and flavor that contradicts any notion of medieval food being uniformly bland. Root vegetables were the foundation: turnips, parsnips, carrots that were often purple or white rather than the orange varieties we know today. These were roasted in the coals of the feast fires, their natural sugars caramelizing into sweetness that provided a perfect counterpoint to the rich meats. Cabbage was prepared in ways that would make modern fermentation enthusiasts nod with approval. Saxon women understood that properly fermented vegetables could provide essential nutrition through the winter months when fresh produce was impossible to obtain. They created early versions of sauerkraut, fermenting cabbage with salt and herbs in clay pots buried in cool earth, where beneficial bacteria would slowly transform raw vegetables into tangy, probiotic-rich food. Leeks, those sturdy members of the onion family that could survive the British winter, were prepared in soups that simmered for hours over the feast fires. Picture great iron cauldrons filled with leek and barley soup, enriched with marrow bones and seasoned with herbs that had been carefully dried and stored since summer. The soup would be thick enough to sustain a working man through a day of hard labor, but delicate enough in flavor to please the most refined palate, but perhaps the most ingenious. Saxon feast food was blood pudding, a dish that modern diners might find challenging, but which represented the absolute pinnacle of waste not, want not cooking. When animals were slaughtered for feasts, absolutely nothing was discarded. The blood was caught in large bowls, mixed with barley, onions, and herbs, then stuffed into cleaned intestines and boiled until firm. The result was something like a savory custard, rich with iron and protein, flavored with herbs and spices that made it far more appealing than its ingredients might suggest. Picture slices of blood pudding fried until crispy on the outside, served alongside roasted meats as a dish that was both nutritious and delicious. Waste transformed into wealth through skill and creativity. Saxon cheesemaking during festival times elevated dairy preservation to high art. The cheese served at feasts wasn't the simple farmer's cheese of daily life, but aged varieties that had been carefully tended for months. Some cheeses were wrapped in nettle leaves, which prevented spoilage while adding a subtle herbal flavor. Others were aged in caves or buried in earth, techniques that produced complex flavors that could rival the finest. Modern artisanal cheeses top picture wheels of cheese the size of cartwheels, their rinds hard and protective, their interiors creamy and sharp with the kind of complex flavors that develop only through patience and skill. These cheeses would be brought out with ceremony, cut with special knives that had been used for no other purpose, served on wooden platters that had been polished until they gleamed like jewels in the firelight. The sweets of Saxon feasts were marvels of ingenuity, created without the refined sugar that would later transform European cooking. Honey was the primary sweetener, but Saxon cooks understood how to coax sweetness from other sources as well. Fruits were dried and concentrated, their natural sugars intensified through careful dehydration. Apples, pears, and berries became chewy treats that provided energy and sweetness throughout the winter months. But the crown jewel of Saxon desserts was honey cake, a creation that transformed simple ingredients into something approaching magical. Picture layers of cake made with honey, eggs, and carefully ground grains, alternated with thick cream that had been sweetened with more honey and flavored with herbs like mint or rose petals. The finished cake would be decorated with nuts and dried fruits, creating a dessert that was both visually stunning and deliciously complex. The beverages served at Saxon feasts went far beyond the mead I described earlier. Apple cider, fermented until it had a pleasant alcoholic kick, was the common drink for everyday consumption. But festival cider was something special, aged for months, sometimes years, until it developed complex flavors that could rival wine. Some ciders were flavored with herbs or spices, creating drinks that were refreshing, intoxicating, and medicinal all at once. Perry, made from fermented pears, was considered even more refined than cider. The best perry was made from specific varieties of pears that grew in certain regions, their fruit prized for the delicate balance of sweetness and acidity that created the perfect base for fermentation. Picture goblets of perry glowing pale gold in the firelight, their flavor subtle and sophisticated, the drink of choice for the most important toasts of the evening. The social aspects of Saxon feasting were as carefully orchestrated as the food preparation. Seating arrangements reflected social hierarchy, but they also provided opportunities for diplomacy and alliance building. A lord might seat a potential rival beside him, using the intimacy of shared food to transform enmity into friendship. Young warriors would be seated near established heroes, learning proper behavior and absorbing the stories that would shape their own understanding of honor and duty. Picture the feast hall filled with conversation and laughter, the sound of knives scraping against wooden platters, the occasional burst of song as someone was moved to share a particularly stirring tale or clever verse. Children would dart between the benches, carrying messages and small treats, learning the complex social dynamics that governed their community through observation and participation. The gifting that accompanied Saxon feasts was as important as the food itself. Hosts would present guests with specially prepared foods to take home, wheels of cheese, jars of honey, loaves of the finest bread. These gifts weren't mere gestures of hospitality. They were statements of status, promises of future alliance, and practical provisions that might mean the difference between comfort and hardship in the months ahead. As the feast progressed and the night deepened, the foods would become lighter, simpler. Nuts and dried fruits would be passed around in wooden bowls, their natural oils and concentrated sugars providing the energy needed for the storytelling and singing that would continue until dawn. Picture the gradual transition from the formal feast to the informal celebration, the way community bonds were strengthened through shared food and shared experience. And now, as the last of the honey cakes are shared and the final toasts are drunk, let your mind drift toward the engineering marvels that made such abundance possible. the Roman innovations that brought fresh water to cities and enabled the kind of urban life that could support grand feasts in stone palaces rather than wooden halls. Let your mind drift now from Saxon feast halls to the sun-drenched hills of ancient Rome, where human ambition carved channels through solid stone and bent the very landscape to their will. Close your eyes and imagine standing on a hillside 30 miles outside Rome, watching a ribbon of clear water flowing through an archway that seems to stretch toward the horizon like a giant's bridge. This is the Roman aqueduct system, perhaps the most audacious engineering project in human history. And tonight, I'll tell you its secrets. Picture the Roman engineer, Sextus Julius Frontinus, appointed by Emperor Nerva in 97 AD to oversee Rome's water supply, walking the length of the Aqua Claudia on a morning when the Mediterranean sun painted the limestone arches gold and the water sang its ancient song of flowing abundance. Frontinus understood that he was maintaining not just pipes and channels, but the very circulatory system of empire, the network that made possible the baths, fountains, and flush toilets that defined Roman civilization. But let me start at the beginning, with the springs. Roman aqueducts didn't begin with grand architecture. They began with water itself, with springs bubbling up from underground streams that had been flowing since before humans walked the earth. Roman engineers were master hydrologists, understanding the subtle signs that indicated the presence of underground water, the types of plants that grew in certain areas, the behavior of morning mist, the way animals created paths across the landscape. Once they found a suitable spring, the real artistry began. Roman surveying techniques were so precise that they could maintain a steady, downhill grade over distances that would challenge modern engineers. The Aqua Claudia, for example, dropped only 381 feet over its 43-mile journey from source to city, an average grade of less than 2 feet per mile. This required surveying instruments of remarkable accuracy and mathematical calculations that had to account for the curvature of the earth itself. Picture the surveying team at work. Men with bronze instruments, measuring angles and elevations with the patience of monks illuminating manuscripts. They used a device called a groma for establishing right angles, and a korobits, essentially a sophisticated water level, for determining precise elevations. The head surveyor would spend months walking the proposed route, calculating grades, identifying obstacles, and planning the most efficient path for the water to follow. The construction process was a marvel of organization and engineering. Roman aqueducts weren't simply elevated archways. That's just the most visible part of systems that were mostly underground. Picture miles of channels carved directly into bedrock, lined with hydraulic concrete that would remain watertight for centuries. This concrete was made from volcanic ash found near Naples, mixed with lime and water to create a material that actually grew stronger underwater, a chemical property that modern engineers didn't fully understand until the 20th century. Let me tell you about the spicus, the actual water channel itself. Imagine a tunnel just large enough for a man to walk through, its walls and floor lined with smooth concrete, its roof shaped in a gentle arch that provided maximum strength while minimizing the amount of expensive materials needed. Every few hundred yards, vertical shafts provided access for maintenance crews, openings that allowed Roman engineers to clean sediment, repair cracks, and ensure the steady flow of water that kept the empire running. The Romans understood something that wouldn't be rediscovered until modern times: the importance of water quality. The Spicus wasn't just a channel, it was a treatment system. The steady flow prevented stagnation. The concrete lining filtered out impurities, and settling tanks allowed sediment to collect where it could be easily removed. Roman water quality standards were so high that many modern cities would be proud to achieve similar purity levels. But the most impressive aspect of Roman aqueduct technology was their solution to the problem of valleys. When an aqueduct encountered a depression in the landscape too wide to bridge with arches, Roman engineers created inverted siphons, essentially enormous pipes that carried water down one side of a valley and up the other. Using the principle of communicating vessels that any child playing with a garden hose discovers intuitively, picture the construction of these siphons: massive lead pipes, some large enough to walk through, carefully joined and tested to withstand the enormous water pressure at the bottom of the system. The pipes were laid in trenches and covered with concrete, creating buried rivers that flowed uphill through pure hydraulic pressure. At the top of each siphon, air vents released the bubbles that could disrupt flow, while settling tanks removed debris before the water continued on its journey. The Pont du Gard in southern France represents the pinnacle of Roman aqueduct architecture. Though it's just one spectacular section of the 31-mile NGM's aqueduct system, picture this 3-story bridge rising 160 feet above the Garden River, its golden limestone blocks fitted together so precisely that they've stood for nearly 2,000 years without mortar. The engineering precision required to calculate the stresses and loads is staggering. Each stone was cut to exact specifications and positioned to distribute weight in a pattern that has defied earthquakes, floods, and the mere passage of time. Let me tell you about the Roman approach to water distribution within the city itself. Water from the aqueducts flowed first to the Castellum Divisorium, a distribution tank where the flow was divided according to imperial decree. 1/3 went to public fountains and baths, 1/3 to private customers who paid for the privilege, and 1/3 was held in reserve for emergencies. This wasn't just engineering, it was social policy implemented through hydraulic infrastructure. The public fountains that received the first share of water were marvels of both function and beauty. Picture fountains placed every few blocks throughout the city, each one a small architectural gem where neighborhood residents could collect fresh water in clay vessels. These fountains ran continuously, their overflow channeling into the street drains that carried wastewater out of the city. The constant flow prevented contamination and ensured that fresh water was always available, free of charge, to every citizen. But the private water connections tell us even more about Roman society. Wealthy Romans could pay for direct connections to their homes, pipes that brought fresh spring water directly to their kitchen, garden, and private baths. The size of these connections was strictly regulated bronze plates with holes of specific diameters, determined how much water each customer could receive. The Romans had invented the water meter, essentially charging customers based on the volume they could access. Picture a wealthy Roman villa with water flowing from springs 30 miles away directly into marble basins, where the owner could bathe in luxury that emperors of earlier ages couldn't have imagined. The water was so abundant that it could flow continuously through the house, in the kitchen for cooking and cleaning, in the garden for irrigation, in the bath complex for the elaborate bathing rituals that were central to Roman social life. The Roman understanding of hydraulics extended to waste management as well. The same engineering principles that brought fresh water into the city also carried wastewater out through an elaborate sewer system. The Cloaca Maxima, Rome's great sewer, was large enough to navigate by boat and sophisticated enough to handle the waste from a city of over 1 million people. This wasn't just drainage, it was public health engineering that prevented the waterborne diseases that devastated other ancient cities. But let me tell you about the maintenance of these systems. Because Roman aqueducts weren't just built, they were continuously maintained by teams of specialists who understood every aspect of hydraulic engineering. Picture the equerry, the water workers who walked the aqueduct lines daily, checking for leaks, clearing blockages, and repairing damage before it could affect the water supply. These men carried tools and materials for emergency repairs, and they knew every inch of the systems they maintained. The seasonal maintenance was particularly impressive. Every year, sections of the aqueduct system would be shut down for thorough cleaning and repair. Sediment would be removed from settling tanks, concrete would be patched and renewed, and the entire system would be inspected with the thoroughness of a modern nuclear power plant maintenance schedule. This wasn't reactive maintenance, it was preventive engineering that kept the systems running for centuries. Roman aqueduct technology included innovations that wouldn't be seen again until the Renaissance. They created automatic overflow systems that diverted excess water during periods of high flow, preventing damage to the infrastructure. They built check dams and settling basins that managed water quality. They even created primitive turbines that used water power to operate mills and other machinery. Picture the sound of water flowing through these ancient channels, a constant whisper that connected mountain springs to city fountains, that carried the snowmelt of distant peaks to the baths where Roman citizens relaxed after a day of building an empire. This wasn't just infrastructure, it was the sound of civilization itself, the proof that human ingenuity could overcome the limitations of geography and bring abundance to places where nature provided only scarcity. The psychological impact of abundant water on Roman society can't be overstated. Citizens of Rome took long, luxurious baths, not just for cleanliness, but as social rituals that reinforced their identity as civilized people. The public baths were meeting places, business centers, and social clubs all rolled into one, made possible by the endless flow of fresh water from distant springs. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Roman aqueduct engineering was its sustainability. These systems operated entirely by gravity, requiring no external energy source beyond the natural flow of water downhill. They were renewable, efficient, and environmentally harmonious in ways that modern water systems, dependent on electrical pumps and chemical treatment, struggle to match. As the Roman Empire declined, the maintenance of these aqueduct systems became increasingly difficult. The specialized knowledge required to operate them was lost as political chaos disrupted the careful administrative systems that had kept the water flowing. One by one, the aqueducts fell into disrepair, and the abundant water that had defined Roman civilization dwindled to a trickle. And now, as we follow the last drops of Roman spring water as they flow through ancient channels toward a city that will soon learn to live without the abundance it had taken for granted, let your mind drift toward another kind of abundance, the vast libraries where human knowledge was collected, preserved, and ultimately lost to the turning of ages and the carelessness of time. Now let your mind drift from the flowing waters of Roman engineering to an even more precious stream, the flow of human knowledge through the great libraries of the ancient world. Close your eyes and imagine walking through streets that smell of papyrus and ink, of cedar wood and lamp oil, where the most precious treasure wasn't gold or silver, but scrolls that contained the accumulated wisdom of civilizations. Tonight, I'll tell you about the libraries that preserved human thought, and how their loss echoes still in the gaps of what we know about our own past. Picture the great Library of Alexandria on a morning in the 3rd century BC, when the Mediterranean sun streams through clear windows and illuminates dust motes dancing above reading tables, where scholars from across the known world bent over scrolls that contained secrets we can barely imagine. This wasn't just a library, it was humanity's first attempt to collect all knowledge in one place. A project so ambitious it makes our modern internet seem almost modest in comparison. The Library of Alexandria began with the vision of Ptolemy I, one of Alexander the Great's generals, who became pharaoh of Egypt after Alexander's death. But it was his son, Ptolemy II, who transformed this vision into the ancient world's greatest intellectual institution. Picture the younger Ptolemy walking through construction sites where workers assembled the largest building complex ever dedicated to learning, its halls designed to house not just books, but the scholars who would study them, and the workshops where new knowledge would be created. The collection methods of the Alexandrian librarians were remarkably systematic and, by modern standards, somewhat ruthless. Every ship that entered Alexandria's harbor was searched not for contraband, but for books. Any scrolls found were confiscated, taken to the library to be copied by teams of skilled scribes. And then sometimes the originals were kept while copies were returned to their owners. Picture the complaints of merchants who arrived with personal libraries and departed with hastily made copies. Their treasured original texts, now part of the world's first comprehensive collection. But let me tell you about the physical reality of these ancient libraries, because they were marvels of architecture and organization that wouldn't be matched for over 1,000 years. The Library of Alexandria wasn't a single building, but a complex of structures surrounding the famous museum, literally a shrine to the muses. Picture colonnaded walkways connecting reading rooms, scriptoriums, lecture halls, and residential quarters where visiting scholars could live while pursuing their research. The scrolls themselves were stored in wooden cabinets called armaria, each one carefully labeled with tags that identified the author, title, and subject matter. The Alexandrian librarians developed the first systematic catalog system, organizing knowledge by subject in a way that influenced library science right down to the present day. Imagine rooms filled with these wooden cabinets, each one containing dozens of scrolls, and the whole collection representing the intellectual output of the entire Mediterranean world. The scale of the collection was staggering. At its peak, the Library of Alexandria may have contained over 700,000 scrolls, though ancient numbers are notoriously unreliable. What we know for certain is that the collection included works in Greek, Egyptian, Hebrew, Persian, and Indian languages, making it the world's first truly international library. Picture scrolls containing the complete works of Euripides, mathematical treatises by Euclid, medical texts by Hippocrates, and geographical works describing lands so distant that they seemed mythical. But the Library of Alexandria was more than just a repository. It was an active research institution where new knowledge was created daily. The scholars who worked there weren't merely librarians, but active researchers, pushing the boundaries of human understanding. Eratosthenes calculated the circumference of the earth using nothing but shadows and geometry, achieving an accuracy that wouldn't be improved upon for centuries. Aristarchus proposed that the earth orbited the sun, an idea so revolutionary it was largely ignored until Copernicus rediscovered it nearly 2,000 years later. Picture the daily life of these ancient scholars. Men like Apollonius of Rhodes working on his epic poem about Jason and the Argonauts, or Callimachus compiling his massive bibliography of Greek literature. They would rise with the sun, eat a simple breakfast of bread and olive oil, then spend their days in the reading rooms, copying texts, making notes, and engaging in the kind of intellectual discussions that advanced human knowledge, one conversation at a time. The copying process itself was a marvel of ancient technology. Picture the scriptorium where teams of scribes worked in coordinated silence, copying texts with the precision of machines. The head scribe would read aloud from the original, while dozens of copyists transcribed his words onto papyrus or parchment, creating multiple copies simultaneously. The best scribes could copy with such accuracy that modern scholars sometimes can't tell which manuscript was the original and which was the copy. But let me tell you about another great library, one that represented a different approach to knowledge preservation. The Library of Pergamon, located in what is now Turkey, was founded in the 2nd century BC as a deliberate rival to Alexandria, when the Ptolemies, jealous of Pergamon's growing reputation, banned the export of papyrus to their competitors. The scholars of Pergamon perfected the production of parchment-processed animal skins that proved to be more durable than papyrus and could be written on both sides. Picture the workshops of Pergamon where craftsmen transformed sheepskins and goatskins into writing material, so fine that it revolutionized book production throughout the ancient world. The word parchment itself derives from Pergamon, a testament to the city's contribution to the preservation of human knowledge. The books produced there were bound in wooden covers and could be opened like modern books, a format that was more convenient than scrolls and more durable than papyrus. The Romans' attitude toward libraries was characteristically practical and systematic, where the Greeks had focused on creating comprehensive collections of existing knowledge. The Romans built libraries as part of their urban infrastructure, the way they built baths and theaters. Every major Roman city had its public library, funded by wealthy citizens who understood that access to books was a mark of civilization. Picture the Library of Trajan in Rome, built in the early 2nd century AD as part of Trajan's Forum. This wasn't just a library, but a multimedia complex with separate sections for Greek and Latin works, reading rooms designed for different types of research, and lecture halls where scholars could present their findings to the public. The building itself was a marvel of Roman engineering, with sophisticated ventilation systems to protect the books from humidity and fire-resistant construction that kept the collections safe for centuries. But the most poignant of all the lost libraries was the Imperial Library of Constantinople, the collection that represented the last great attempt to preserve the knowledge of the ancient world. Founded by Constantine the Great in the 4th century, this library was designed to be the successor to Alexandria, a place where Christian and pagan knowledge could coexist and where the intellectual heritage of Greece and Rome could be preserved for future generations. Picture the scholars of Constantinople in the 6th century AD, men like Photius and John Philoponus, working desperately to copy and preserve texts that they sensed were in danger of being lost forever. They created summaries and commentaries that preserved at least the essence of works whose originals were crumbling away. Without their efforts, we would know even less about ancient literature and philosophy than we do today. The process of loss was gradual and heartbreaking. Picture a monk in 7th century Constantinople, faced with the choice between copying a work by Aristotle or a commentary on Scripture, choosing the religious text because it seemed more relevant to his Christian world. Each such decision, made thousands of times over centuries, gradually eroded the accumulated knowledge of antiquity until only fragments remained. Climate played a crucial role in determining which works survived and which perished. The dry climate of Egypt preserved papyrus documents that would have crumbled to dust in more humid environments, which is why we have Egyptian papyri but relatively few manuscripts from libraries in wetter climates. Picture archaeologists finding perfectly preserved documents in Egyptian ruins, texts that provide tantalizingly brief glimpses into the vast libraries that once existed. Throughout the ancient world, fire was always the greatest enemy of ancient libraries. The flammable nature of papyrus and parchment meant that a single accident could destroy centuries of accumulated knowledge in a matter of hours. The partial burning of the Library of Alexandria during Julius Caesar's siege of the city in 48 BC destroyed an unknown number of irreplaceable texts, though the library continued to function for several more centuries. Fire was always the greatest enemy of ancient libraries. The flammable nature of papyrus and parchment meant that a single accident could destroy centuries of accumulated knowledge in a matter of hours. The partial burning of the Library of Alexandria during Julius Caesar's siege of the city in 48 BC destroyed an unknown number of irreplaceable texts, though the library continued to function for several more centuries. But perhaps more devastating than fire was simple neglect. Picture a library in the 5th century AD, its funding cut by a government more concerned with military defense than intellectual preservation. The building falls into disrepair, the roof leaks, and moisture destroys manuscripts that had survived for centuries. The remaining books are sold or given away to private collectors, scattered like seeds on barren ground, where they slowly disappear from human memory. The Islamic conquests of the 7th and 8th centuries AD created a complex situation for ancient libraries. While some collections were destroyed in the chaos of conquest, others were preserved and translated by Islamic scholars who recognized their value. Picture the House of Wisdom in Baghdad, where Arabic translations of Greek texts were created with the same dedication that the original Alexandrian scholars had shown in collecting them. These Arabic translations became the thread that connected the ancient world to the Renaissance. Works by Aristotle, Ptolemy, and Galen survived not in their original Greek, but in Arabic versions that were later translated back into Latin by medieval European scholars. Picture the irony: European Christians rediscovering their own intellectual heritage through Islamic intermediaries who had preserved what Christendom had allowed to perish. The loss of these libraries represents more than just the destruction of books. It represents the severing of human memory, the breaking of the chain that connects us to our intellectual ancestors. We can only guess at what knowledge was lost, what insights into mathematics, medicine, literature, and philosophy disappeared when the last copies of unknown works crumbled into dust. Modern attempts to calculate the scope of the loss are staggering. Scholars estimate that we possess less than 1% of the literature produced by the ancient Greeks, and perhaps 5% of Latin literature. Entire genres of writing have vanished completely. We know, for example, that the Greeks produced extensive travel literature, but almost none of it survives, except in fragments quoted by later authors. Picture Sappho, the greatest lyric poet of ancient Greece, whose works filled 9 volumes in the Library of Alexandria. Today, we have one complete poem and fragments of a few others, tantalizing glimpses of a poetic genius whose voice has been almost entirely silenced by time. How many other Sapphos are lost to us completely, their names not even surviving in later quotations? The scientific loss is equally devastating. Ancient mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and engineering reached levels of sophistication that weren't matched again until the Renaissance or later. We know this from the surviving fragments, but we can only imagine what systematic knowledge was lost when the libraries that preserved it fell into decay. Yet something of these libraries survives in ways that their creators could never have imagined. The organizational principles developed by ancient librarians influenced every subsequent attempt to systematize human knowledge. The scholarly methods pioneered in Alexandria and Pergamon laid the foundation for modern academic research. The very concept of the library as a public institution serving the entire community is a gift from the ancient world to ours. And now, as we close this gentle journey through the ruins of human memory, let these images settle in your mind like dust on ancient scrolls. The morning light streaming through the windows of Alexandria, the whisper of parchment pages turning in Pergamon, the quiet conversations of scholars who understood that knowledge was humanity's greatest treasure. Sleep now and dream of libraries that existed only in memory, of books that live on only in fragments, of the eternal human desire to preserve wisdom for those who will come after us. May these memories of lost knowledge guide you into peaceful dreams, where perhaps the great libraries still stand and all the wisdom of the ancient world waits patiently to be rediscovered. If you drifted off somewhere in our journey tonight, if these whispered stories of ruins and recipes, of mead halls and aqueducts helped carry you toward sleep, Let me know below in your own time-sweet dreams, friends. Until we meet again in these quiet hours when history becomes lullaby, rest well.